You know that feeling when life just clicks? Everything falls into place, like you've hit some kind of stride. I had that, a beautiful wife, two amazing kids, and a successful engineering business I'd built from the ground up. By most standards, I'd made it. I had a home full of laughter and love, the respect of my employees and clients, and a life that felt solid, unbreakable. Or so I thought. The day it all started unraveling was a regular weekday. Nothing unusual, really. I came home from work around 6, set my things down, and headed toward the bathroom to wash up. And that's when I saw it, a tiny, insignificant-looking piece of plastic glinting on the bathroom floor, right under the sink. It was a pill backing, a birth control pill backing, to be exact. That shouldn't have been there. I'd had a vasectomy 2 years earlier. Caroline and I had made that choice together. It was supposed to make life simpler, free of the need for any kind of precautions. So the sight of that little pill strip didn't add up. At first, I chalked it up to, I don't know, maybe an old one she forgot to throw away or something. I mean, we'd been together a decade, had 2 kids, and I trusted her more than anyone in the world. We were a team. But as I stood there, looking at that tiny piece of plastic, something started nagging at me. I shrugged it off and went about my evening, trying to ignore that strange feeling. But it didn't go away. In fact, it only got worse over the next few days. Looking back, I realized I should have seen the signs much earlier. Little things that, at the time, seemed harmless but now fit together like pieces of a twisted puzzle. I started noticing how much Caroline had changed over the last few months. She'd become distant, but in ways that were easy to overlook in the daily grind. She used to tell me everything, what she'd done at work, how her friends were doing, even what she thought about some random thing she'd heard on the radio. But lately, she'd gotten quieter, always busy or tired, brushing off my questions with short answers. And then there were the late nights. Caroline worked in marketing, so late meetings weren't exactly unheard of, but it had never been like this. She'd come home later and later, saying there'd been a client dinner or some big project deadline. Sometimes, she'd leave the house after dinner, saying she needed to get a head start on the next day's work. She always had a reason, and like the idiot I was, I took her word for it. I'd watch her walk out the door, thinking it was just temporary, just part of the demands of her job. But it wasn't just the late nights. She started putting more effort into her appearance, too. New clothes, makeup she hadn't worn in years, even a different perfume. I'd tease her about it sometimes, tell her she looked great, but all I'd get was a distracted smile, like she was a million miles away. I told myself she was just going through a phase, maybe feeling the pressures of her job, or maybe even a midlife thing. She was still the same person, still my Caroline, right? I kept finding excuses for her, reasons to dismiss every little thing that didn't add up. But every time I looked at her, the doubts would creep back. They were small at first, like an itch I could ignore, but they kept growing, becoming harder to push aside. And that's when I started paying attention. The first real crack came one evening while I was helping the kids with their homework. Caroline's phone, which was sitting on the counter, lit up with a message. Normally, she kept her phone close, something I hadn't even thought much about before. But tonight, she'd left it charging across the room. I ignored it at first, figuring it was nothing. But then it lit up again, and again. I finally glanced over, just out of curiosity. The name that popped up on her screen wasn't one I recognized. Just the first name, Paul. And the message preview read, "Can't stop thinking about last night. Can't wait to see why," before it cut off. I felt a chill go down my spine. Can't stop thinking about last night? I tried to play it off. Maybe it was an old friend from work, someone she'd met at a conference, any kind of innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew. No friend sends that kind of message. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I didn't want to believe my wife, the mother of my children, could be involved in anything like that. But the seed was planted, and I couldn't unsee it. I started noticing more. When she was home, she'd constantly be on her phone, her face lit up by the screen in that way that made her look like she was in another world. Sometimes she'd get up in the middle of dinner, saying she had to take a call for work, or she'd forget her phone in another room if I walked in while she was texting. And her smile, she'd be staring at her phone, smiling at something, and I'd wonder if she ever looked at me that way anymore. It hurt to even think it, but I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. And one night, As she stood in the doorway, getting ready to run to the office, I felt something inside me snap. I told her I was worried. I told her it seemed like she was working more than usual and asked if everything was okay. She smiled, assured me it was all just work, that she was pushing through a stressful time, and thanked me for understanding. She reached out, gave me a kiss, and walked out the door. I stood there for a while after she left, staring at the door, feeling numb. The woman I'd loved for a decade, the mother of my children, was keeping something from me. I knew it now, with a certainty that sank like a weight in my chest. But the thought of confrontation was almost paralyzing. If I asked her outright, and she admitted something, how could I come back from that? And if she denied it, could I really believe her? That night, I barely slept. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. I wanted proof, something concrete, so I wouldn't be left wondering if I was just imagining things. I needed to know for my own sanity, and for our kids. So, I made a decision I never thought I'd make. I'd gather the truth myself. The next day, I set out on a path that would change everything. I started with the basics, her credit card statements, phone records, anything I could access without raising suspicion. It felt wrong, sneaking around like this, but the more I found, the less doubt I had. Charges at fancy restaurants I'd never heard of, hotel receipts for weekends I thought she'd spent at work. I felt like my world was caving in. Every discovery chipped away at the life I thought we had, revealing something ugly and painful underneath. After a sleepless night and the start of my own investigation, things took a darker turn. The more I uncovered, the more certain I became that my life was a lie, one that Caroline had woven around me with a skill that was as chilling as it was devastating. Each discovery was like a blow, each piece of evidence a betrayal I couldn't ignore. I'd thought that marriage was a partnership, that we were a team, but it became clear that my trust had been a one-way street. I started my investigation by looking at her phone bill. It was easy enough. I paid the bills, after all. I'd never been suspicious before, so I never had reason to check. But now, as I looked through the call history and text logs, something immediately jumped out. There was one number that appeared again and again, day after day, at all hours. It was logged under the name Paula, an innocent enough name, except that Caroline didn't know anyone named Paula, and this Paula had been in contact with her more than I was. I wrote down the number, stared at it for a while, wondering if I should call it. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed more than just a name on a phone bill. I couldn't accuse her of something so serious with only this. But as I stood there, staring at the number, I felt a new determination set in. I would find out the truth, no matter how painful it was. Over the next week, I gathered more. I watched her closely, making notes of her habits, her schedule. She seemed to have more work commitments than usual, more late nights, and each time she left, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. One evening, as she got ready for another one of her mysterious work dinners, I mentioned that I had a late meeting too. She gave me an odd look, a mix of surprise, and I thought, maybe a little worry. "Didn't know you were that busy lately," she said, her eyes flickering to the side. "Neither did I replied, forcing a smile. "But you know how work gets." As she left the house, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. I kept my distance, my heart racing as I trailed her car through the streets. Part of me still hoped it was all a misunderstanding, that she was heading to some work function, just like she'd said. But as she pulled into the parking lot of a dimly lit restaurant on the other side of town, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I watched her park, watched her get out of the car, and then I watched a man approach her. They hugged. She laughed, a laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. My heart sank as they walked into the restaurant, her hand on his arm. I didn't follow them inside. I couldn't. I just sat there in my car, feeling a mix of rage and heartbreak that I'd never known was possible. When I got home that night, she was already there, lying on the couch like nothing had happened. She looked up, smiled at me, asked how my meeting went. I forced a smile, my voice steady, though my insides were churning. "Fine," I said. "It was fine." I went upstairs, closed the door, and tried to breathe. The next few days were a blur. I went through my usual routines, putting on a show for the kids, keeping up appearances for work. But inside, I was falling apart. I kept coming back to that image of her with him, that easy, carefree look she used to give me. It was gone now, replaced by something I couldn't even recognize. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I needed answers. One night, after she went to bed, I crept downstairs and checked her phone. I'd never done that before. It felt wrong, like a violation of privacy. But my life had already been violated, hadn't it? As I scrolled through her messages, my worst fears were confirmed. Conversations with Paula, the man from the restaurant. Texts that left no doubt about what they were to each other. Messages filled with affection, shared secrets, plans for weekends I thought she'd spend at work. The words felt like knives. And then I found something else, something that took this betrayal to a whole new level. In one of their messages, she mentioned the kids, our kids. She told him about the things they'd been up to, even sent him a picture of our daughter's soccer game. My heart pounded as I read it. This man, this stranger, knew things about my children, things I thought were only shared between me and Caroline. That was the moment I realized I had to know everything. I couldn't let this go on. The next morning, I made a call. I never considered doing something like this, but desperate times, well, they force your hand. I hired a private investigator, someone who could do what I couldn't. If there was more to find, I wanted it all. I needed to know every detail, however painful, so I could make a clean break, cut her out of my life with no regrets. A few days later, the investigator called me back. He had pictures, dates, receipts, everything I needed to piece together the timeline of her affair. They'd been meeting for months, in hotels and quiet restaurants across town. They had weekend trips I'd thought were work retreats. And in one particularly bitter blow, he even found pictures of them together at the same beach where we'd taken our kids last summer. Only this time, she looked like a different person. Free. Happy. I kept a calm face through it all, though inside, I was burning. I didn't want her to know what I'd found until I had everything in place. I'd given her enough trust, enough time, and now it was my turn to control the story. Finally, the investigator handed me one last piece: paternity test results. I hadn't wanted to believe it, but after everything I'd seen, I had to be sure. The results confirmed my worst fear. Neither child was mine. Neither. I can't describe what that moment felt like. It was like being hollowed out from the inside, like the world I'd built my life around had crumbled into nothing. The children I'd loved, raised, and sacrificed for, they weren't even mine. And the woman I'd built my world around? She betrayed me in the worst way possible. That night, I confronted her. I waited until the kids were asleep, then sat her down in the living room. She looked at me with those familiar eyes, the ones I'd once thought were full of love and trust. But now they were the eyes of a stranger. I laid it all out calmly, methodically, like presenting an engineering report. I showed her the pill backing, the receipts, the pictures. Her face paled as I pulled out the paternity test results. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to lie. She just sat there, her face blank, as if all this had no weight, no meaning. What do you have to say for yourself? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She stammered something about mistakes, about needing an escape, as if that would make any difference. But I wasn't listening. Her words were empty, meaningless. I told her I was filing for divorce, that I would do everything in my power to keep her away from everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built. I told her she'd taken enough from me, and now it was my turn. She sat there, shell-shocked, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy. Just a cold, burning need to be free from her, from everything she'd turned my life into. That was the last real conversation we had. The next day, I called my lawyer and started the process. I also began protecting my business, making sure she couldn't touch a cent of it. I was done giving her any more of my life. After confronting Caroline and filing for divorce, I felt a strange mix of devastation and relief. It was like emerging from a nightmare, only to realize the world I'd woken up to was no less painful. I'd spent years building my life with her, loving her, trusting her. Now all of that was shattered, left in pieces around me. But I was determined to reclaim what I could, my dignity, my future, and most importantly, my peace. I knew it wouldn't be easy. In the days that followed, I threw myself into protecting my assets. I spent hours meeting with my lawyer, combing through every detail to make sure Caroline wouldn't see a penny more than necessary. I'd worked too hard to let her betrayal take what was mine, and I wasn't about to let her get away without facing the consequences. During one of those long meetings, my lawyer, Tom, leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a mix of sympathy and respect. "Gary," he said, "I've seen a lot of these cases. Most people don't have the clarity you do. It's impressive." I nodded, managing a small smile. "I just want to get through this, Tom. I want my life back. My real life." "Then we'll make sure that happens," he assured me. And for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. But even as I focused on the legal aspects, the emotional weight of it all didn't disappear. I had to face my kids every day, knowing the truth about their paternity but not having the heart to tell them. They were still so young, and despite everything, they were innocent. They had no idea what was going on, and I wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. I'd loved them from the day they were born, and as much as I felt betrayed, that love hadn't just vanished. Some nights, after they were asleep, I'd sit alone in the dark, grappling with questions I couldn't answer. What kind of life would they have now? How would I be able to continue as their father when every reminder of Caroline's lies cut so deep? And then there was the lingering, gnawing thought. Would they still see me as their dad if they ever found out? Despite everything, I had to keep going. I couldn't just abandon them. So I showed up every morning, made their breakfast, helped with homework, took them to the park. I forced myself to smile, to laugh, to give them some semblance of normalcy. They needed stability, even if my own life was falling apart. If I was going to be their dad, I had to be all in, even if it tore me apart inside. And then there was the matter of Caroline's job. She'd taken advantage of me, of our life, of the trust I'd put in her for nearly a decade. And if I was done giving her any more of my life, I was also done letting her walk away unscathed. Her actions needed consequences, real, unavoidable ones. She'd met this man, her so-called Paula, at work. She'd lied to me about work dinners, weekend trips, all under the guise of her career. I wanted to take that from her, make her feel what it was like to lose everything. I didn't do it out of anger, though. I did it because it was what she deserved. She disrespected everything we had, everything I'd built. It was time she faced the cost. One afternoon, I reached out to an old friend who worked at the same company as Caroline. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but when I explained the situation, he was quick to listen. I laid out the details, sparing nothing. He promised he'd pass along the information discreetly, and by the end of the week, Caroline's work trips were no longer a mystery. Her boss found out, and within days, she was out of a job. I heard through the grapevine that her exit was anything but graceful. The next time I saw her was at a meeting with our lawyers. She was visibly shaken, looking at me with a mixture of shock and anger, but I didn't care. She'd betrayed me, and now she was dealing with the fallout. I stared back at her with a calm indifference, watching as she realized how serious I was about cutting her out of my life. She tried to speak to me afterward, asking me to hear her out, to understand. But I had no interest in her explanations. "Gary, please," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk about this? Privately." I shook my head, my face expressionless. "There's nothing left to say, Caroline. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them." As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure, like I'd finally closed a chapter that had been weighing me down. But there was still a lot to sort out. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work, rebuilding my life brick by brick. My company became my refuge, a place where I could focus, where I could drown out the chaos of my personal life. My business partner and close friend, Tom, was a constant source of support. He'd known about the divorce, though I'd kept the details private. One day, after a particularly grueling meeting, he pulled me aside. "Gary," he said quietly, "you don't have to do this alone. If you ever need to talk, just say the word." I looked at him, grateful for the offer, but unsure how to even begin. How do you explain to someone that everything you thought you knew was a lie? How do you tell them that your own kids aren't yours, that the woman you loved had been betraying you for years? "Thanks, Tom," I finally replied. "I might take you up on that." In the months that followed, I found myself leaning on him more than I expected. He became my sounding board, my confidant, someone who reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I felt. It was through him that I met Michelle, one of the firm's financial consultants. Michelle was kind, straightforward, and had a way of cutting through the nonsense that I found refreshing. She'd been through her own share of hardships, and she seemed to understand without me even having to explain. At first, we only talked about work, about numbers and accounts, but as time passed, our conversations became more personal. She'd ask how my kids were doing, or if I'd had a chance to take a break, and those simple questions, those small gestures of kindness, became something I looked forward to. She never pried, never asked about the divorce, but she was there, a quiet presence that made the weight I was carrying feel a little lighter. One evening, after a long day, she invited me for coffee. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to let anyone in after everything I'd been through. But something in her calm, understanding smile made me say yes. As we sat in a small cafe, sipping coffee and talking about everything from work to life's absurdities, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: ease. I wasn't putting on a show or hiding my pain. I was just being. Michelle didn't push or probe. She just listened, laughed at my dry humor, and shared pieces of her own story. And for the first time since Caroline's betrayal, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my life. But even as I grew closer to Michelle, the past still lingered. Caroline tried to reach out a few times, sending messages through mutual friends, trying to get me to reconsider. She'd even left a few handwritten letters in my mailbox, letters filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. She reminded me of our early years, the memories we'd shared, the dreams we'd once had. Part of me wanted to confront her, to ask her why. Why had she done this? Why had she thrown away everything we'd built? But I knew that no answer would ever satisfy me. Nothing she could say would erase the betrayal, the lies, the stolen years. So I kept my distance, ignoring her messages, her attempts to worm her way back in. I'd given her more than enough, and I was done. My life was moving forward, and I refused to let her drag me back. The divorce proceedings were brutal, as I expected. Caroline fought for as much as she could get, trying to claim parts of the business, assets I'd worked my entire life to build. But with Tom's help and a solid legal team, I managed to protect what mattered most. She got a fraction of what she demanded, enough to cover her basic needs, but nothing more. When it was finally over, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The chapter was closed, the ties severed, and I was free. I looked at the paperwork, at the final decree that ended nearly a decade of marriage, and felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I'd loved her once, trusted her with everything, but that woman was gone. All that remained was a memory, a ghost from a life that no longer belonged to me. As the months passed, I found myself spending more time with Michelle. She became a constant in my life, a presence that brought warmth and stability when I needed it most. We took things slow, letting our friendship deepen naturally, without any pressure. She understood what I'd been through, and she respected the pace I needed. In her, I found something I'd thought I'd lost forever: trust. One evening, after a quiet dinner, we sat in her living room, talking about everything and nothing. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that I admired, and said, "You're stronger than you think, Gary. You've been through hell, but you're still here." And that says a lot. Her words stayed with me. She was right. I'd been broken, yes, but I hadn't given up. I'd built my life back from the ground up, piece by painful piece. And now, for the first time, I was ready to move forward, to embrace the life I'd fought so hard to reclaim. Looking back, I see now that Caroline's betrayal was a wound that cut deep, but it wasn't the end. It was a chapter, a painful one, but a part of a story that was still unfolding. With Michelle by my side, I felt a new sense of purpose, a hope I hadn't known in years. I'd lost a lot, but I'd gained something too: wisdom, resilience, and a renewed faith in the possibility of love. In the end, Caroline's lies didn't define me. I was still Gary, a man who valued loyalty, integrity, and family. And though my family looked different now, though the life I'd built had changed, I knew I was ready to face whatever came next. The months that followed the divorce were a test of endurance. It felt like my life had been reduced to rubble, and I had to rebuild it from scratch, brick by brick, while managing the weight of what had happened. Every now and then, memories of my life with Caroline would come back like unwelcome guests. Moments of laughter, shared dreams, plans we'd made for the future. But now, those memories felt hollow, tainted by the truth of her betrayal. I had to remind myself, those dreams were built on lies. I was done with them. My kids were my priority. They didn't know the details, and I intended to keep it that way. I stayed in their lives with full commitment, showing up at every soccer game, every school event, every bedtime story. The fact that they weren't biologically mine didn't change what they meant to me, and I wasn't about to abandon them. They'd been lied to just as much as I had, and they needed stability more than ever. If I had to swallow my pain to give them that, I would. The relationship I was building with Michelle continued to grow. She had been a quiet presence through the chaos of the divorce, and I realized that with her, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to put on a brave face or hide the hurt. I could be honest, vulnerable even. And in return, she gave me something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine compassion and understanding. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Michelle and I were sitting on my porch talking. The night was calm, the air crisp, and there was a quiet ease between us that felt comforting. "Do you ever think about the future, Gary?" she asked softly, her gaze steady, curious. I thought about that for a moment. The truth was, I hadn't allowed myself to think much about the future, not in a meaningful way. So much of my life had been about survival lately, just getting through each day without falling apart. But looking at Michelle, I felt a glimmer of hope, a small sense that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life beyond this. "I do sometimes," I replied, "but it's hard to imagine right now. After everything, I'm not sure what that future looks like." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "One step at a time, right?" I smiled, grateful for her patience. She didn't push or pressure me. She was willing to let things unfold naturally, letting me find my way at my own pace. And that, more than anything, made me feel safe with her. For the first time, I realized that maybe I didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe healing was about finding comfort in the questions. Work became my other outlet. I poured myself into projects, working long hours, throwing everything I had into my firm. It wasn't just a distraction. It was a reminder of what I'd built, of my capabilities. In a strange way, it grounded me, made me feel like I had control over something in my life. I could rely on my skills, on my dedication, and I was determined to make my business thrive. One afternoon, I was in the middle of reviewing a proposal when my phone buzzed with a message from Caroline. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, and seeing her name flash across the screen stirred a mix of anger and exhaustion. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was short, simple. "I miss the kids. Can I see them?" I'd known this was coming. Despite everything, Caroline hadn't completely lost her attachment to them, or so it seemed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another one of her attempts to worm her way back in, to salvage whatever scraps she could. Still, I owed it to the kids to keep things civil for their sake. After a few moments, I replied, "They're available this weekend. Let's keep it simple." She responded almost immediately, agreeing to a few hours on Saturday. I arranged to drop them off at a park near her new apartment, making it clear that this was temporary, on my terms. I wouldn't let her come in and out of their lives as she pleased. If she wanted to be a part of their world, she'd have to prove she was serious, committed, and stable. Saturday arrived, and as I pulled up to the park with the kids, Caroline was already there, waiting. She looked different, tired, worn down in a way I hadn't seen before. It was strange, seeing her like this, a version of herself that felt so unfamiliar. The kids jumped out of the car, running to her with excitement, and for a moment I felt a pang of jealousy, a reminder of the family we used to be. But I pushed it aside, reminding myself that the person she'd shown me over the past year wasn't the person I thought I'd married. I watched from a distance as they talked and laughed, Caroline doing her best to keep up with their energy. She glanced over at me a few times, her expression unreadable. I stayed where I was, watching but keeping my distance. I didn't want to interact with her more than necessary. When the time came to leave, she brought the kids back to the car, her gaze lingering on me as they climbed in. "Gary," she started, her voice soft, tentative. "I know I've done terrible things. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm trying to do better. For them." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. I didn't want her apologies. Words were cheap. I'd learned that the hard way. If she was going to make any difference in the kids' lives, she'd have to do it through her actions, through consistency and honesty, qualities she hadn't shown in a long time. "Then prove it," I said finally, my voice steady. "They deserve better." She looked at me, something shifting in her eyes, a sadness or maybe even guilt. But it didn't matter. I was done trying to decipher her motives. She'd made her choices, and now she'd have to live with them. In the weeks that followed, Caroline's attempts to reconnect with the kids were sporadic. She'd reach out, ask for time with them, then disappear for days without contact. It was a painful reminder of her inconsistency, her inability to commit even to her own children. I tried to shield them from the disappointment, doing my best to be there, to fill the gaps she left. It wasn't easy, but I was determined. They deserved a stable parent, and I'd do whatever it took to be that for them. As for Michelle, our connection grew stronger with each passing day. She'd become an anchor in my life, a source of calm in the storm. Slowly, cautiously, I found myself opening up to the possibility of a future with her. It felt surreal, thinking about love after everything I'd been through, but there was something real between us, something that felt solid, trustworthy. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she reached over and took my hand. I looked at her, seeing the kindness, the patience, and the unwavering support she'd shown me since we'd met. In that moment, I realized that the life I'd thought was destroyed hadn't ended. It had just changed. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something better. "I know it's been hard," she said quietly, her hand warm in mine. "But you're not alone, Gary. You don't have to carry this by yourself." Her words sank in, a quiet reassurance that melted some of the weight I'd been holding on to. I didn't have to carry it all alone. With her, with the kids, with the life I was slowly rebuilding, I felt the beginnings of something new, a second chance, a chance to find happiness again. And for the first time, I let myself believe in it. After the divorce, it was as though my world had quieted for the first time in months. Without the constant tension, without the need to monitor every action, I had space to breathe again. But with that space came a new kind of pain, the hollow realization that my life as I knew it was over, my family as I'd envisioned it gone. The future was a question mark, and I wasn't sure who I was outside of the life I'd built with Caroline. But somewhere in the silence, I began to sense something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I continued to focus on the kids. I kept showing up for them. And while every interaction carried a mix of love and betrayal, it became easier to see beyond the lies. I was still their dad. Nothing could change that. They called me Dad, looked to me for guidance, joy, comfort, things I had given them from the day they were born. Biology was just a fact. What we shared was real, a bond formed over years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and after-school talks. If I walked away now, I would lose more than Caroline ever could take. As the days passed, I found strength in the structure I'd built. I had my work, my kids, and the quiet company of Michelle. She'd come into my life when everything was falling apart, and somehow she'd managed to bring a calm that steadied me. She didn't press for answers or ask questions I wasn't ready to face. Instead, she was simply there, her presence like a beacon in a storm. She became someone I could lean on, and as we shared more of our lives, I started to let down my walls. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Michelle came by with dinner. We sat in the kitchen, talking about everything from work to childhood memories. She had this way of listening, really listening, and it reminded me what genuine care felt like, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for so long. She listened as I spoke about the kids, my fears for their future, and the burden of this strange love and loss I carried for them. "You know," she said quietly, "the fact that you're still there for them, even after everything, that says more about you than anything else." Her words stuck with me. I didn't know if I deserved that kind of admiration, but it felt good to hear it, to feel understood. She was right. I was there for them because that was what they deserved, and maybe that was what I needed too. My family might look different, but it was still mine. As Michelle and I grew closer, I started to feel something I hadn't expected: possibility. I'd been so focused on surviving the divorce, on keeping things together, that I hadn't thought about what might come after. But with Michelle, there was something new, something solid that didn't feel like it could break or turn against me. I couldn't deny the warmth she brought into my life, a gentle understanding that went beyond words. One night, as we sat on the porch, she reached for my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound. She looked at me, her eyes steady and sincere, and said, "I know you're still healing, Gary. And I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know I'm here whenever you're ready." That was all she said. She didn't push for more, didn't ask me to be anyone other than myself. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could open myself to the possibility of a new life, a life I hadn't planned, but one that could still hold happiness. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, I felt a little more like myself. The anger that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The betrayal would always be there, a part of my story, but it didn't have to define me. I was more than Caroline's lies. I was a father, a man who'd built something worth holding on to. And maybe I was someone worthy of love again. One morning, I received a final notice from my lawyer. The divorce proceedings were officially completed. It was over. The chapter was closed, the ties severed. I stared at the paperwork, the stark black letters on the page, and felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. This was the end of a life I'd once cherished, but it was also the beginning of something new. That evening, I took the kids to the park. As I watched them play, their laughter filling the air, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. They were my world, my constant, and no matter how things had changed, they would always be mine. And as I stood there, watching them, I felt a presence beside me. Michelle had come by, a quiet smile on her face, as she joined me, slipping her hand into mine. We didn't say anything. We just stood together, watching the kids, sharing a moment that felt whole and real in a way I hadn't felt in years. With her by my side, I knew that I could face whatever came next. With the divorce behind me, I felt an undeniable shift. There was a weight that had been lifted, though I'd never expected it to feel so bittersweet. Caroline was gone from my life, and I was free to focus on the people who mattered most, the kids and, somehow, Michelle, who'd become my anchor through it all. In the weeks that followed, my life found a new rhythm. The kids continued to be my constant joy, reminding me every day that I was more than the betrayal I'd endured. I poured myself into the moments we shared. Homework, weekend adventures, bedtime stories. They were innocent, shielded from the hurt, and I was determined to keep it that way. We were still a family in a way, and nothing could take that from us. Michelle remained a steady presence, and over time, what we had evolved into something deeper, something honest. One evening, as we sat on her porch, she looked at me with that quiet, reassuring gaze of hers and said, "Gary, you're stronger than you know, and I'm glad I get to see this new chapter with you." Her words stayed with me. I'd spent so long feeling like I was stumbling through the wreckage, but somehow, with her by my side, it felt possible to believe in a future worth embracing. With Michelle, there was no pretense, no need to pretend that everything was fine. She knew my story, the pain and betrayal, and she accepted all of it. The next few months were a period of quiet transformation. I'd learned to navigate my new normal, taking pride in the life I was rebuilding. Work continued to flourish, my firm stronger than ever, and at home, I created a safe haven for the kids. Each day felt like a step toward healing, and for the first time, I began to feel a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the resilience that had kept me standing, for the lessons I'd learned, and for the people who'd helped me find my way. One weekend, we all went to a local fair, Michelle, the kids, and me. Watching them laugh and run from ride to ride, with Michelle's warm smile beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, steady hope that the life ahead could be something beautiful, even after everything I'd been through. Standing there with them, I realized I was exactly where I needed to be. Life had been shattered, yes, but it had also brought me to a place I hadn't known I needed. My heart was stronger now, wiser. And as I looked at Michelle and the kids, I knew that, while the scars would remain, they no longer defined me. Moving forward wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. For my kids, for myself, and maybe for a new love built on truth and respect.